Have you ever felt trapped in a cycle that seems to have no end? Have you ever looked at your bank statement and felt that tightness in your chest, wondering, how did I get here? Have you ever felt like money slips through your fingers, no matter how hard you try every day? If you've ever experienced something like this, today's story might be just what you need to hear. Benjamin Hall was like many of us, hard-working, honest, but completely suffocated by debt and a silent sense of failure. He woke up tired, went to sleep worried, and life always seemed one step ahead, slipping through his fingers. Until a simple video, the kind that appears when we least expect it, planted a question in his mind, and nothing was the same again. What you're about to hear is a journey of transformation, discovery, and personal power. A true story about how the mind can be a prison or a key, about how the law of attraction entered Benjamin's life, and with it, a new way of living, thinking, and thriving. Oh, and before diving into this transformative story, are you already subscribed to this channel? If not, take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and comment below where in the world you're listening to this story from. Let's build a space of inspiration and change together. Benjamin woke early, but it seemed the day was already weary. The bills piled high on the kitchen table told a story he already knew by heart. Delays, interest, charges, and that hollow feeling in his chest. The money never arrived. In fact, it barely arrived, and when it did, it already had a specific destination, and it wasn't peace of mind. The rent always came before the paycheck. His credit card was always maxed out, as if it had a life of its own, and delighted in mocking him. Benjamin made do as best he could, taking on a side job here and there, but nothing seemed enough. He felt like he was chasing his own tail, never getting anywhere, an invisible prison made of bills, fear, and exhaustion. He avoided looking at his bank statement, like someone closing their eyes to avoid seeing the abyss. There were days when he wondered how he'd ended up there. He wasn't lazy, nor complacent. On the contrary, he always worked hard, always tried to do the right thing, but something felt off, as if life was always 2 steps ahead, mocking his attempts. Every trip to the grocery store was a war mission, calculator in hand, heart in mouth. I'd give up buying simple things, convincing myself I didn't really need that much. Inside it hurt, not because of the lack of superfluous items, but because of the lack of freedom, of lightness, of breathing without fear of an unforeseen event knocking everything over. Over time, frustration began to weigh more heavily than debt. What hurt wasn't just the debt, but feeling small, powerless, trapped in a script he didn't write. But what if the problem wasn't just external? What if it were possible to change everything, starting from within? A different thought whispered, that gray morning. Benjamin tried to ignore it, but it was hard to ignore. He scrolled through his social media feed and saw childhood friends posting about trips, new cars, expensive dinners. Meanwhile, he counted pennies for the bus fare. Deep down, he knew not everything was as it seemed, but still, it hurt. It hurt to see other people's success and not understand where he had gone wrong. Sometimes he found himself wondering if there was something wrong with him. Why did it seem so much harder for him? He was the same age as many of them there. He'd studied, pursued, and fought, and yet he lived as if he were always starting from scratch. The victories of others slapped him in the face like reminders of everything he didn't yet have. At family gatherings, it was almost automatic. Someone would share an achievement, and he'd smile, but inside he'd cringe. Comparisons would arise, even without words. A younger cousin starting a business, his sister buying an apartment, and he was there, stuck in a loop he couldn't break. Each comparison was a jab at his self-esteem. But the cruelest thing was what he told himself when no one was listening. You're not good enough. You weren't born for this. These things aren't for people like you. Harsh, sharp words that echoed in his mind like absolute truths. And over time, these inner voices became invisible walls too high to climb. It was then that Benjamin heard, For the first time, someone talked about limiting beliefs. It felt like a mirror, uncomfortable, but revealing. Did he believe deep down that he didn't deserve to succeed? Did he harbor ideas that weren't even his own? This new perspective planted a curious seed which would gradually begin to germinate. From a young age, Benjamin heard phrases that today, with a little more awareness, sound like traps. Money doesn't grow on trees. Rich people are thieves. We're born to fight. He grew up believing that wealth was a sin, that comfort was too much of a luxury for those who came from the bottom. All of this was true and lodged itself deep within, without asking permission. His parents were hard-working, honest, but always living on the edge. He saw the effort, but also the exhaustion. Money was a rare visitor, and when it appeared, it quickly left. No one talked about abundance. Talking about wealth was ugly, almost offensive. The mentality was one of scarcity, and Benjamin absorbed it without realizing it. Over time, these ideas became certainties. He didn't even question them. When he saw someone growing in life, he became suspicious. He thought there was something wrong behind it. When he tried to achieve more, he felt guilty, as if he were betraying his roots. It was as if there was an invisible ceiling installed by voices from the past, and he never knew how to break it. But something began to bother him. What if all this was just old programming? An emotional inheritance that could be reframed. For the first time, Benjamin wondered if he was repeating patterns that weren't his own, but had been passed down from generation to generation. That ignited an uncomfortable and liberating spark. From then on, he began to observe his thoughts more closely. He realized that before he complained about life, there was already a voice telling him that nothing would change. That before he tried, the fear of failure already arose. It was then that he began to understand that if he wanted to change externally, he needed to start internally. And perhaps the first step was admitting that there was another way of seeing the world. It was an ordinary night, but filled with a strange silence. Benjamin stared at the ceiling, motionless, his eyes open and his chest tight. He'd just received another collection call, and his salary, already compromised, hadn't even arrived yet. The sound of the spinning fan seemed to mock the whirlwind swirling in his head. Something was breaking inside. He got up, went to the mirror, and looked at himself in a way he hadn't in a long time. He was tired, but not just physically, tired of fighting and not moving, of pretending everything was fine. That night, with no one around, he cried. But it wasn't an ordinary cry. It was a cry of emptying, of cleansing, of breaking with the old. There, facing himself, he felt he couldn't continue as he was. He didn't know what he would do, or how. He only knew he needed to change, even if it was just a fraction of a day. For the first time, he recognized he was in a cycle, a mental, emotional, financial cycle, and that he needed to break this cycle with something he didn't even fully understand yet. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion and openness that he remembered a video he had watched days before. A young man was talking about how his thoughts shaped reality, about the law of attraction. At the time, Benjamin thought it was beautiful, but distant. But now, with his heart on the floor, those words came back with a new weight. What if it were real? It was just the beginning of a strange, almost timid curiosity. But that moment of rupture in silence and tears raised a question he could no longer ignore. Could life really be different if he changed inside? Undeterred, he decided to investigate, and that choice would open doors he hadn't even known existed. Benjamin opened his phone aimlessly, just to try and distract his mind. Among random videos, that same face he'd seen days ago appeared. A smiling man, talking about energy, thought, and vibrational frequency. Only this time, he watched it all the way through. Something about that speech resonated with him. It was as if someone were narrating exactly what he was feeling. The idea that thoughts create reality seemed absurd at first, but the more he listened, the more it all began to make sense. He realized how he spent all day repeating negative phrases, how he expected the worst before even trying. It was as if he had learned to fail before learning to imagine something new. The video talked about the power of intention, about feeling as if you already had what you wanted, even without seeing anything yet. Benjamin, curious, decided to give it a try. He had nothing to lose. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed himself, for a minute, to imagine a life without debt, with peace, with plenty, with freedom. His heart even beat differently. That night he fell asleep thinking about it, and for the first time in months, he slept peacefully. He woke feeling light, as if his body had truly rested. His mind was still fuzzy, but something there seemed more quiet. It was as if a gap had opened between him and the old programming that was suffocating him. He didn't understand everything, but something inside him told him he was on the right path. The desire to delve deeper only grew. After all, if life was a reflection of what one thinks, what one feels, then perhaps it was time to look more deeply within. And so began a new journey, one that little by little would transform not only his ideas, but his very destiny. In the days that followed, Benjamin found himself thinking about the ideas in that video. He began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed, the thoughts that dominated him, the words he repeated, the feelings he harbored without realizing it. Like a detective of his own mind, he began to identify patterns, and each discovery came with a slight shock. I think like that all the time. He then dove in. He searched for books, watched more videos, took notes. The subject consumed him, but in a good way, like finding water after a long time in the desert. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about a new way of seeing himself, of being in the world. For the first time, he felt like he had a key in his hands. It was as if an invisible door had opened. Benjamin began to question everything. Were his limitations just external, or were they rooted within him? Could he really change his destiny by changing his vibration? This wasn't just curious. It was exciting. He began to see life as a personal experiment, and that changed everything. Little by little, even the little things took on new meaning. A morning coffee became a source of gratitude. A walk became a moment of connection. Benjamin no longer moved on autopilot. He observed his thoughts, adjusted his words, and even smiled to himself when he noticed a subtle shift in how he responded to challenges. This new perspective made him more attentive, and one of those light mornings, he heard about something that seemed like the first concrete step on this new journey. A simple yet powerful exercise, one that required only the courage to imagine in detail the life he hadn't yet believed possible. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Benjamin closed his eyes. The instructions were simple. Imagine what his ideal life would be like, but feel as if it were already real. At first it seemed like a joke, but he tried hard. He visualized himself debt-free, with money to spare, living in a more peaceful place. And for a moment, he let himself be moved by that image. It wasn't just thinking, it was feeling, and that made all the difference. He placed his hand on his chest and breathed slowly, as if savoring a future reality that was beginning to take shape in the present. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but something in him vibrated differently. This felt more real than what he saw in the mirror. Over the next few days, he repeated this exercise several times, always in the same place, in the same position, almost like a secret ritual. He noticed that throughout the day, he found himself smiling as he remembered the images he had created. It was as if he had planted a seed, invisible, yes, but alive, pulsating, full of promise. It was during this phase that Benjamin began to understand that faith isn't about believing when everything is already resolved. It's about trusting even without proof. It's about nourishing the image before seeing the result. And there, in that solitary practice, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, but not the anxious kind, but the quiet kind that calms and strengthens. And while he was still dealing with bills and challenges, he realized that something inside him had already changed. It was as if, even in the chaos, he had found a small island of peace. But not everything would be so simple. That afternoon, with the window open and the sun streaming into the room, Benjamin decided to give it a try. He grabbed an old notebook, one of those forgotten ones at the bottom of a drawer, and wrote at the top of the page, "My new reality." The proposal was simple yet powerful. Describe what his ideal life would be like, as if he were already living it. He wrote from the heart, without censorship. He let the words flow, as if they were telling a secret the universe needed to hear. He saw himself living in a peaceful place, debt-free, working what he loved, helping his parents, feeling peace when he woke up. And as he wrote, he tried to feel what it would be like to be there, to truly experience it. At first, it felt a bit forced, but all it took was a little surrender for the emotion to begin to well up. His eyes welled up, his chest warmed. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to dream in detail. Then he closed his eyes and visualized everything he'd written. He imagined the smell of the new house, the sound of the calm silence, the feel of the new sofa, the texture of the bill paid. It was like an internal film, but he was the protagonist, no longer an extra. This wasn't just an exercise. It was a rehearsal for what was to come, a seed being watered by the power of intention. Over the next few days, he repeated the ritual. He wrote, visualized, felt, and little by little, this practice became a habit. It was no longer an effort. It was each time he accessed this new version of himself, it felt like a new reality was getting a little closer. He still didn't see any changes in the external world, but inside, everything was already beginning to transform. And it was in this silence filled with faith that Benjamin began something greater. A journey where it wasn't enough to simply imagine, it was necessary to sustain that vibration. And in one of these moments of introspection, he realized that his greatest enemy wasn't the outside world, but the voice within. No matter how much he practiced, Benjamin began to notice something strange. Every time he finished a visualization, a voice would emerge from deep within, a quiet but insistent voice. This is nonsense. You're deluding yourself. Reality is different. It was as if, even as he tried to plant something new, there was a soil inside that still resisted. And this resistance hurt. In moments of inspiration, he felt capable of anything. But all it took was a bill or a piece of bad news for everything to fall apart. It was as if the old version of him, the one shaped by scarcity, was fighting to maintain his footing. The battle wasn't against the world, but against old thoughts masquerading as truths, and confronting them required more than strength. It required awareness. There were days when he wanted to give up. He doubted whether it all made sense, but something inside him, however small, insisted, keep going, and it was this voice, more subtle, softer, that he chose to listen to. Benjamin understood that the confrontation wasn't a sign of failure, but of growth. It was the old being challenged by the new, an inevitable clash on the road to transformation. He began to talk to these inner voices like someone talking to a frightened child. He told himself, it's okay to doubt, but we'll try one more time. And so, gently he began to reprogram his own thoughts. His faith began to grow, not because it was blind, but because it was cultivated even in the face of doubt. In this back and forth between belief and hesitation, something magical began to happen. Answers that had previously seemed distant began to arrive in the form of signs, encounters, and loose phrases. It was as if the universe was saying, you are on the right path. And in this new rhythm, Benjamin learned to listen, even to what wasn't expressed in words. One day, Benjamin was walking home, lost in his thoughts, when a phrase on a graffitied wall caught his eye. You create your reality. He stopped, looked again. It seemed like a direct answer, as if someone had read his mind. It was just a phrase on a random street, But in that moment, it carried the weight of a revelation. After that, other signs began to appear. A forgotten book on a newsstand, titled The Secret of the Millionaire Mind. A random audio message on a cell phone, talking about vibration. A stranger on the bus, talking about gratitude. None of this seemed random. It was as if the universe were sewing little messages into the fabric of everyday life. Benjamin began to pay more attention. Instead of complaining, he began to observe. Every coincidence became a clue. Every detail, a confirmation. He felt something guiding him, even if he couldn't see the whole map. It was a new, almost magical sensation, as if he and life were finally moving in the same direction. These signs didn't come with ready-made answers, but with intuition. Sometimes it was a feeling in his chest, a sudden urge to do something, call someone, change his route, and every time he followed that intuition, something unexpected happened. The flow began to align. He still couldn't explain it, but he felt he was no longer alone on this journey. This is how Benjamin realized that visualization wasn't enough. He also needed to listen to life, his body, encounters, coincidence, and through this active listening, he began to open himself up to more concrete changes that little by little would also require a new attitude, a new way of living daily life. Benjamin's mornings began to take on a new rhythm. Before any obligation, he would take a few minutes just for himself. He would close his eyes, take a deep breath, and visualize how he wanted his day to go. He would repeat simple phrases like, "I am prosperous, I attract opportunities, money comes to me lightly and steadily." It wasn't automatic, it was felt. It was almost a conversation with the universe. Instead of rushing out as before, he now drank his coffee slowly, with presence. He wrote down 3 things he was grateful for, even if it was just the sunshine streaming through the window or the bread on the table. This practice made him realize that, even amidst the chaos, there were blessings. And the curious thing, the more he recognized these blessings, the more they seemed to grow. Throughout the day, Benjamin made an effort to monitor his thoughts. When he caught his mind complaining, he would stop and shift his focus. It was a constant but liberating exercise. He understood that he couldn't control everything, but he could choose how to react. And this simple choice was taking deep root in his new mindset. At night, he would write in the notebook again, not as a diary of regrets, but as a record of victories, big and small. Every achievement, every sign, every good feeling earned a place there. The notebook became a mirror of change, a daily reminder that he was, indeed, transforming his life, one thought at a time. Over time, the once burdensome routine became a ritual. Benjamin no longer saw these moments as chores, but as nourishment for the soul. And it was within this new frequency that he began to realize something even more powerful. Gratitude had ceased to be an isolated practice, and was becoming a state of being. Benjamin began to realize that gratitude was more than a polite gesture. It was a magnet. The more he gave thanks, the more good things happened. Not necessarily big events, but small surprises. A lower bill, an unexpected sale, a returning customer. It was as if the universe was saying, "Did you see that? Then here's more." Before, he thought he needed to achieve something to be grateful. Now he understood it was the opposite. Gratitude came first, like a seed. He was grateful for opportunities that hadn't even arrived yet, and this faith mixed with gratitude created a different energy. It was as if his frequency was attuned to something greater, lighter, more fluid. Gratitude also healed wounds. When he remembered the past, the difficulties, the times when everything seemed lost, he took a deep breath and thanked for having overcome. This gave new meaning to the pain. It was as if even the setbacks had been part of a plan for growth. And now, everything made sense, even what had previously seemed unfair. Over time, giving thanks became automatic. He'd wake up and give thanks. He'd find a coin on the ground and smile. He'd come home tired but grateful. Benjamin no longer saw life as a struggle, but as a gift. And this new attitude changed his energy, his conversations, his relationships. It was a silent but profound transformation. It was then, carried away by this vibration, that he discovered something that could further enhance his connection with what he desired. A practice that united emotion, intention, and image. Something he had already been doing little by little, but now, with greater awareness, would become a pillar of his transformation, creative visualization. Benjamin discovered that imagining in detail was like traveling to the future with his feet still in the present. It wasn't just thinking about something good. It was seeing himself there, feeling it, smelling it, hearing it. He created a dream board with images cut out of magazines. A bright house with a porch, a comfortable car, a cell phone screen with the bank balance he dreamed of achieving. It became a silent portal. Every day, he spent a few minutes looking at those images. But he didn't just look. He closed his eyes and put himself inside them. He saw himself waking up in that house, driving that car, helping his parents, feeling the peace of having everything under control. His heart raced, his eyes sometimes filled with tears, and in those emotions he immersed himself. He soon realized that the more intense the emotion, the stronger the connection. His mind couldn't distinguish between reality and imagination, and that was gold. He could, at any moment, access a vibrational state of prosperity. Even without having the physical money, it was as if his soul was already experiencing what his body was still on its way to achieving. And it was during this daily practice that something curious happened. The fear of the future began to fade. In its place came a calm confidence. Benjamin no longer needed proof. He felt everything was falling into place. And this feeling, this silent certainty, became his greatest strength. Visualization was no longer an exercise. Now it was a natural state. But life, like any good story, likes to test its protagonist. And just when everything seemed to be falling into place internally, the external world decided to shake things up. It was at this moment that Benjamin learned that maintaining a high vibration amidst chaos is where true power is revealed. It was on a random Tuesday that everything began to change. Benjamin received a message from an old schoolmate he hadn't spoken to in years. The young man was starting a small online business and needed someone to help with customer service. He remembered Benjamin, who had always been patient and organized. The invitation seemed simple, but it carried something different, an energy of new beginnings. The offer was modest, a symbolic sum at first, but Benjamin accepted wholeheartedly. Something inside him told him it wasn't just a job, but a door, and it was. Within a few weeks, his dedication attracted attention. He began receiving small commissions, then referrals. The money still wasn't much, but it was no longer scarce. For the first time, he felt like he was in the flow. The most interesting thing was how effortlessly everything seemed to unfold. He didn't force anything. He didn't rush desperately. He simply aligned himself internally, and opportunities came to him, as if the vibration he cultivated had opened silent pathways in the universe. What once seemed like luck now felt like synchronicity. Each small achievement strengthened his faith. What he had silently envisioned was now beginning to take shape in the physical world. It was still early days, but the feeling was that something much greater was being built. One step at a time, with steadfastness and gratitude. Benjamin was seeing, with his own eyes, the power of the energy he nurtured daily. And it was in this new setting, amidst deliveries, conversations, and learning, that he began to notice another, more subtle but even more profound, change. The way he felt about himself. The prosperity that had previously been solely financial now began to blossom from within. As the days passed, Benjamin realized that his greatest wealth wasn't the money that was starting to come in. It was the way he felt when he woke up. Before, he'd rise with an invisible weight on his shoulders. Now there was a lightness, a desire to live. The anxiety that had previously dominated his mornings had given way to a calm, almost silent confidence. He began to see himself differently. He no longer blamed himself for past mistakes. He realized that every choice, no matter how wrong it seemed, had brought him to this point. This new, more conscious and compassionate version of himself wasn't born from an external miracle, but from internal work that had been nurtured daily. It was a new identity taking shape from the inside out. Benjamin no longer expected validation. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The recognition he'd sought his entire life was now within him, and this reflected in everything: his posture, his speech, his decision. He began to attract different people, different opportunities, and experiences that seemed in tune with this new vibration. The transformation was so profound that even without realizing it, it inspired those around him. Friends commented, "You look different." Family members asked what he had done, and Benjamin just smiled, because he knew it wasn't a course, nor a magic formula. It was the change from within, the invisible change that now radiated throughout everything. But like every true journey, challenges still existed. Life continued to test his faith. There were days when old doubts tried to return, but now he knew how to cope, because the difference between who he was and who he was becoming was already impossible to ignore. Just when everything seemed to be going well, life, with its silent wisdom, decided to test Benjamin. A promising partnership proposal suddenly fell apart. An important client disappeared without paying, and an unexpected expense knocked on the door, demanding attention. For a few seconds, the old feeling of helplessness tried to return. Fear kicked in, doubt too, but now he was no longer the same. He took a deep breath. He sat in the same corner where he visualized his dreams, and instead of complaining, he gave thanks. He was grateful for the opportunity to show himself that he trusted, even without guarantees, that he would choose to maintain his vibration, even in the face of instability. This wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation to steadfast. Benjamin understood that the tests weren't meant to punish him. They were meant to solidify what he'd been building. It was as if the universe was saying, "Are you ready to sustain this new version?" Even when everything seems to be falling apart. And he decided to respond with action. He continued performing his rituals, reinforcing his beliefs, walking with faith even in the dark. With each stumble, he came back stronger. He used his falls as momentum. It was no longer about living without problems, but about no longer being knocked down by them. Benjamin learned that prosperity is not the absence of challenges, but the presence of awareness. And it was this awareness that began to shape in an increasingly visible way the reality around him. And as if the universe were watching every step, waiting for this firmness to blossom, something new was about to happen. Something that would come as a clear, concrete answer, as if to say, "Now, yes, you are ready to harvest." Through the ups and downs, Benjamin remained steadfast in his decision to believe. It was like tending a plant that hadn't yet flowered, but which he knew was alive, growing silently. Faith for him became a discipline. It was no longer about feeling motivated, but about staying aligned even when the world screamed otherwise, and that changed everything. On days when his mind tried to overwhelm him with long-held doubts, he would breathe and return to center. He would recall his visualizations, reread his gratitude notes, and listen to his favorite audio recordings about prosperity. He built an arsenal of emotional reinforcements. Like a peaceful warrior, he armored himself with presence, repetition, and intention. Persistence didn't free him from fear, but it taught him not to be paralyzed by it. And over time, what had been effort became second nature. He no longer needed to force himself to think positively. It was now part of him. It was as if faith had ceased to be hope and become conviction. And when that conviction took shape, life responded. A new project arose, an unexpected invitation to partner on an innovative idea. And this time he wasn't afraid to accept. The vibe was so aligned that everything seemed to fall into place. It was as if the universe, patiently was just waiting for the moment he truly believed, not just with his head, but with his whole heart. And in the midst of this new cycle, where everything finally seemed to flow smoothly, Benjamin began to notice an almost invisible but immense detail. Money was no longer the center of change. It was a consequence, because the real turning point had happened earlier, inside, when he decided to become the version of himself he always wanted to be. The first seeds began to bear fruit. Benjamin saw his bank account for the first time in a long time, with more than the bare minimum. It was a modest but symbolic amount, a faithful reflection of what he had been cultivating within. And that was when he understood. Money wasn't just the result of effort, it was a consequence of alignment. Life was responding clearly. The debts were paid off one by one, not with desperation, but with dignity. He paid with a discreet smile, as if closing old chapters with gratitude. What had once been suffocation became liberation, and with each bill paid, he felt lighter, more whole. There was no longer any weight, only space. Space for new possibilities. Work was thriving, invitations were increasing, connections were expanding, new people were appearing, proposing partnerships, exchanging ideas and opening doors. Benjamin was no longer the same, and the world around him seemed to recognize this. The magnetism of his new energy attracted more than money. It attracted trust, collaboration, and solutions. The old routine of scarcity had been replaced by a new dynamic of flow, of merit, of abundance. Nothing was forced anymore. It was as if he were now sailing with the wind at his back, without having to row against the current. And the most beautiful thing, the feeling that everything was just beginning. Because deep down, Benjamin knew true wealth went beyond what was in the account. It was the tranquility of laying his head on the pillow without guilt, the sparkle in his eyes when making plans, the peace that comes when life finally begins to smile back. And right there, in the shadows of his new reality, a new understanding began to emerge. Quiet late afternoon, while walking down a quiet street, that Benjamin had an epiphany. He looked around, felt the wind on his face, and thought, I created this, not the street, not the sky, but the moment, the peace, the stability, the vibrancy that surrounded him now was a direct result of what he had cultivated within. It was like waking from an old dream and realizing he was now awake. The penny dropped gently but definitive. Everything that had previously seemed out of control, money, relationships, emotions, had returned to its rightful place within him. It wasn't magic. It was awareness. He had learned to guide his thoughts, to choose his feelings, to notice the signs. And with that, life began to take shape, like clay in the hands of a creator. Benjamin understood that the universe responds not to blind effort, but to clear intention, and that each thought was like a brick in the construction of reality itself. If before he lived by reaction, now he lived by creation. He was the protagonist, master of his own script, and this responsibility, rather than frightening, liberated. The joy came not only from what he was achieving, but from the knowledge of how he was achieving it. It was the certainty that if something went wrong tomorrow, he would know how to start over. Because now he had an internal compass, something no one could take away. He no longer depended on chance. He knew how to access his own power, and that was priceless. And as he deepened this understanding, he began to desire more than just achieving things. He began to feel the urge to share, to inspire, to teach what he had learned. Because when we understand that we create our own lives, we also understand that we can help others do the same. Today, Benjamin's life has a different rhythm. He wakes up unhurriedly, with that pleasant silence that only those who have found inner peace know. Money is no longer a worry. It has become a tool. He uses it consciously, without fear, without guilt. He organizes, invests, achieves, but above all, He shares because he understands that true prosperity is that which overflows. The house where he lives is simple, yet full of soul. Every corner reflects who he has become. The work he has built not only supports his finances, but also his purpose. He feels like he's finally part of something bigger. He works not just for money, but for impact, for meaning, to leave a positive mark on those he crosses paths with. People notice, friends, neighbors, family. Many ask what the secret was, and Benjamin smiles, with that sparkle in his eyes of someone who knows the secret has always been there inside. He talks about the journey, the turning point, the law of attraction, but above all, he talks about what he experienced, because he knows that no one transforms with theory alone. Now, his routine includes teaching, sometimes in casual conversations, other times in content he records from the heart. The boy who once counted coins to pay the bus fare now inspires people to believe that everything can change. And the most beautiful thing is that he doesn't romanticize pain or deny challenges. He simply shows that there is another way, lighter, more conscious, more truthful. But the cycle doesn't end there, because even with his life transformed, Benjamin continues practicing. He visualizes, gives thanks, meditates, feels. He knows that the path to abundance is alive and dynamic, and as he walks with an open heart, a new layer of understanding begins to reveal itself, a layer that speaks of legacy, of essence, of something that goes beyond what meets the eye. Over time, Benjamin understood that what he had built went beyond paying bills and fulfilling dreams. What he was leaving behind was a living example, a silent reminder that no one needs to settle for scarcities. His hives became proof that the mind is a fertile field, and that those who sow with faith reap abundantly. He changed not only his reality, but the atmosphere around him. The people he crossed paths felt it. It was as if his energy spoke before words. And the curious thing, there was no ostentation, no arrogance, only presence, only truth. Only that light glow of someone who no longer carries any weight on their shoulders, only purpose in their heart. Benjamin stopped seeking the perfect life and began creating days filled with intention. He understood that prosperity isn't destiny, it's practice, and that faith isn't waiting around without doing anything, but walking even without seeing the whole ground. He knew that many still lived as he once did. And so he made a point of showing there is a way out, there is light, there is another path. What began as quiet desperation became a mission to remind people that they have power, that everything begins within, that the universe responds precisely to what we feel with all our heart, and that, no matter how dark the night seems, the light always returns. You just have to believe a little more. You just have to decide not to give up. And so between one breath and the next, Benjamin continues, planting words, harvesting stories, rejoicing in all that is yet to come, because the journey isn't over. It's simply changed phase, and what brought him here still pulsates with each new beginning. Benjamin's journey shows us that change doesn't begin with money, nor with luck. It begins with a decision. The decision to stop seeing yourself as a victim of life and start choosing each day a new vibration, a new mindset, a new identity. He didn't win because he had it easy. He won because, even in silence, he chose to believe when everything still seemed the same. And that's perhaps the greatest lesson of all. You don't need to see to start believing, but you do need to believe to start seeing. Maybe you're now where Benjamin started. Maybe your bank account is in the red. Your faith is at its limit. Your heart is weary. But if he could do it, why can't you? The power that changed his life wasn't outside. It was inside. And it's still there, inside you too. If this story touched your heart in any way, leave a comment below. Tell us what inspired you most. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the bell That way you'll continue receiving content like this, which can transform not only your day, but your entire life.